Day stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately felt the difference. The air tasted too clean, too filtered. Even the gravity felt wrong, lighter than Earth's crushing pull that had shaped every muscle in his body. As he walked down the corridor of Kepler Station, his boots made sharp clicking sounds against the polished floor. Around him, his new classmates moved like ghosts, their feet barely making whispers of sound. The Trilaxians glided on cushioned appendages that seemed to float above the ground. The insect-like Vexari moved with delicate precision, each step calculated to avoid disturbing anything around them. Even the hulking Gorath, despite their size, somehow managed to move with the quiet grace of creatures who had never needed to run from predators or fight for survival. Day felt like a bull in a china shop, and he hadn't even done anything yet. "That's the human," he heard one of the crystalline beings whisper to another. Their voices sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Look how heavily he moves, so crude." Veltar, a purple-skinned being with 4 arms and tentacles for fingers, leaned toward his study partner. "I heard humans evolved on a death planet. Constant wars, natural disasters, poisonous atmosphere. No wonder they're so violent and reckless." Day pretended not to hear, but his jaw tightened slightly. He'd heard variations of this conversation a dozen times since leaving Earth. Humans were the new kids in the galactic community, and their reputation preceded them. Violent, unpredictable, dangerous. The fact that they had managed to achieve faster-than-light travel despite coming from what the galaxy considered an uninhabitable hellscape only made other species more suspicious. The orientation hall was massive, with ceiling that stretched up into shadows. Hundreds of students from dozens of species filled the space, their conversations creating a symphony of clicks, hums, whistles, and harmonics that no human throat could produce. Day found a seat in the back, noting how the other students unconsciously left empty spaces around him. Professor Helix took the stage. She was Zephyrian, tall, elegant, with skin that shifted colors based on her emotional state. Right now, she was a calm blue-green, the color of authority and knowledge. Her voice carried easily through the hall without any amplification, a genetic gift from her species' evolution on a world where communication across vast distances meant survival. "Welcome to the Galactic Academy of Sciences," she began, her skin shifting to warmer hues. "You represent the finest minds your species have to offer. Here you will learn not just the technical skills needed for advanced engineering, but the collaborative wisdom that has kept our galactic civilization peaceful and prosperous for over 10,000 years. She began outlining the Academy's approach to learning. Every project required multiple approvals. Every experiment needed extensive peer review. Every modification to existing technology had to pass through committees representing at least 5 different species' perspectives. The minimum time for approving even minor changes was 48 hours, though most took weeks. "Safety is our highest priority," Professor Helix continued, her skin taking on serious purple tones. "We have achieved our technological advancement, not through reckless innovation, but through careful, methodical progress. Each step is tested, verified, and approved by our collective wisdom." Around him, Day watched his classmates nod approvingly. The Kaleth beings chimed in harmonious agreement. The Vexari clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that conveyed deep satisfaction. Even the young Gorath, barely old enough to be away from their hive mothers, rumbled their approval in subsonic frequencies that Day felt more than heard. But Day was barely listening to the professor anymore. His tablet had automatically downloaded the basic course materials, and he was already flipping through them. The fusion reactor designs they'd be studying were ancient by human standards, maybe 50 years old. The power output was pathetic, maybe a tenth of what modern human reactors could produce. The safety margins were so excessive that the reactor would shut down at the first sign of any irregularity, no matter how minor. He started sketching modifications in the margins of his digital notes. Simple changes, really. Reconfigure the magnetic containment fields for better plasma compression. Adjust the fuel injection ratios for more efficient fusion. Remove some of the redundant safety systems that were actually reducing performance. Basic stuff, that any first-year engineering student on Earth would spot immediately. The human approach to technology development, Professor Helix was saying, and Day's attention snapped back to her words, serves as an excellent example of what not to do. They achieved spaceflight through what can only be described as barely controlled explosions, with failure rates that would be considered catastrophic by any civilized standard. More nods and sounds of agreement from his classmates. Dai felt his cheeks burn, but he kept his expression neutral. Their early space program, the professor continued, lost more personnel in its first decade than most species lose in their entire spacefaring history. They regularly attempted missions with less than 50% chance of success. By our standards, this represents not courage, but a fundamental inability to properly assess risk. When she opened the floor for questions, Veltar immediately raised one of his tentacled hands. Professor, what safeguards are in place if the human student disregards our protocols? His species has demonstrated a concerning lack of regard for established safety procedures. The question hung in the air, like a challenge. Day felt hundreds of eyes, optical clusters, and various other sensory organs focusing on him. He could have explained that human recklessness was actually highly calculated risk-taking, refined by millions of years of surviving on a planet that was actively trying to kill them. He could have pointed out that their supposedly primitive approach to spaceflight had actually achieved faster technological progress than any other known species. Instead, he just smiled and said nothing. Let them think what they wanted. Soon enough they'd understand the difference between recklessness and adaptability. Soon enough they'd learn why creatures from Deathworlds didn't need committees to make decisions in a crisis. The orientation continued, but Day had already learned everything he needed to know about his new classmates. They were smart, careful, and completely unprepared for anything that didn't fit their neat, orderly view of how the universe should work. This was going to be interesting. The practical exam room felt like a cathedral of technology. Massive reactor housings lined the walls, each one a perfect replica of the fusion systems that powered galactic civilization. The air hummed with potential energy, and holographic displays showed complex readouts that would have made Earth's best engineers weep with envy. Professor Helix stood before the assembled students, her skin cycling through instructional colors as she explained the exercise. Each team will face a simulated critical reactor failure. You have 4 hours to diagnose and repair the problem using only the tools and materials available in this laboratory. This exercise tests not just your technical knowledge, but your ability to work within established safety frameworks under pressure. The teams formed naturally along species lines. The Trilaxians gathered in their traditional diamond formation, each member facing a cardinal direction to ensure complete situational awareness. The Vexari arranged themselves in hierarchical clusters, with senior students at the center and younger ones forming protective rings around them. The crystalline Kalieth beings resonated together, their bodies literally vibrating in harmony as they synchronized their thought patterns. Day found himself assigned to Team 7, along with Lee Yuna from Trilax Prime, Veltar from Nexus, and a young Gorath named Crix, whose translator sometimes glitched and made him sound like he was speaking through a broken radio. Excellent, Yuna said, her gill slits fluttering with what Dai had learned was excitement among her species. I've memorized all 47 standard diagnostic procedures. We'll have this solved efficiently and safely. Their assigned reactor was Unit 12, a mid-sized fusion chamber that should have been producing steady power for the station's hydroponics bay. Instead, it was dead, dark, and according to the warning displays, potentially dangerous to approach. Yuna immediately began setting up her diagnostic equipment, a collection of sensors and analyzers that looked like they belonged in a surgical suite rather than an engineering lab. First, we perform a complete spectral analysis of the containment field fluctuations, she announced, consulting a tablet thick with procedural checklists. Then we map all possible failure cascades using the standard 17-point matrix. Veltar began arranging his tools with religious precision, each one placed exactly where the manual specified. According to Protocol 7, we must achieve unanimous consensus before attempting any physical intervention, he said, his tentacles weaving through the air in patterns that Day had learned indicated deep concentration among his people. Crix simply stood there, his massive form radiating patience. The Gorath were known for their methodical approach to problem-solving. Some said they were slow thinkers, but Day had learned they were actually incredibly thorough. They just didn't see the point in moving until they were absolutely certain of their next step. While his teammates began their careful rituals, Day walked over to the reactor housing and pressed his ear against the metal casing. The others looked at him strangely, but he ignored them. On Earth, you learn to listen to machinery. Engines had voices, and those voices told you things that no diagnostic computer ever could. This reactor was trying to tell him something important. He could hear a subtle vibration, barely perceptible, coming from somewhere deep in the containment assembly. It wasn't the smooth hum of a properly functioning fusion chamber. It was more like a stuttering heartbeat, irregular and strained. The magnetic field generators were working overtime, trying to compensate for something that was throwing off their careful balance. Fascinating approach, Una said, her voice carrying just a hint of condescension. On Trilax Prime, we have instruments that can detect problems far more accurately than biological senses. Day nodded absently and popped open an access panel. The inside of the reactor housing was a maze of conduits, power relays, and monitoring equipment. Everything was labeled in multiple languages, color-coded according to galactic safety standards, and protected by so many interlocks and fail-safes that it was a miracle the thing could function at all. He could see the problem immediately. One of the magnetic coupling assemblies had shifted out of alignment, probably during installation. It was a tiny error, maybe half a degree off true, but it was causing the entire containment field to work harder than it should. The automatic systems were compensating, but they were doing it in the most inefficient way possible. Found it, he said, reaching for his toolkit. Impossible, Veltar protested, his skin flushing the deep purple color that indicated distress among his species. We haven't even completed the initial safety assessment. You can't possibly have diagnosed the problem so quickly. Day was already disconnecting power relays, his hands moving with the quick confidence of someone who had grown up fixing things that couldn't wait for committees and procedures. Listen, he said, even as sparks began flying from the connections. He was bypassing. You can hear the magnetic field oscillation. The coupling is out of alignment by about 0.4 degrees. Simple fix. Warning lights began flashing as he disabled the first safety interlock. Then the second. The monitoring station erupted in red alerts as he bypassed the third safety system entirely, rerouting power through conduits that were never designed to carry such loads. Stop, Una's voice cracked with panic. You're violating every safety protocol in the manual. Those systems are there for a reason. He's going to kill us all, Veltar added, his tentacles writhing in distress. The power feedback could cascade through the entire station. Crix rumbled something that the translator rendered as inadvisable action pattern detected, but he made no move to interfere. The Gorath were also known for their curiosity, and apparently watching a human work was too interesting to interrupt. Day ignored the protests and kept working. Around the lab, other teams had stopped their own diagnostics to watch in horrified fascination. He could feel their eyes on him as he reached deep into the reactor housing, tools in both hands, sweat beading on his forehead as he worked by touch in spaces that were barely wide enough for human fingers. The magnetic coupling assembly was exactly where he'd expected it to be, and exactly as misaligned as he'd diagnosed from the sound. He loosened the mounting bolts, shifted the assembly back into proper position, and retightened everything to specifications he'd memorized from the manual they'd been given on their first day. The warning lights stopped flashing. The error messages disappeared from the monitoring screens. The reactor's hum changed from that irregular stuttering to a smooth, powerful vibration that resonated through the floor. 18 minutes after he'd started, the reactor was not only fixed, but running at 127% of normal efficiency. The improved alignment had eliminated the energy waste that the original installation had created. Across the lab, Team 3 was still setting up their diagnostic equipment. Team 5 was holding their second committee meeting to discuss which procedures to implement first. Team 1 had successfully completed their initial safety assessment and was preparing to begin the actual diagnosis phase. Professor Helix approached their station, her skin cycling through colors that Day had never seen before. "Explain your methodology," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Day wiped his hands on a cloth and shrugged. "I listened to what the reactor was telling me. Fixed what was broken. Not much more to it than that." The other students gathered around, their various forms of sensory organs focused on him with laser intensity. He could practically feel their disapproval radiating like heat from a forge, but the reactor was running, better than it ever had before. And sometimes that was the only explanation that mattered. The first tremor ran through Kepler Station like a shiver of fear. Day was in his dormitory room, reviewing quantum mechanics homework that seemed laughably simple compared to what they taught on Earth, when the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went quiet. Even the constant hum of the life support system seemed to pause. Then the station bucked like a wild animal. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in angry red as students stumbled from their rooms, confusion written across dozens of different alien faces. The emergency klaxons began their bone-deep wailing, a sound designed to cut through the hearing ranges of every species on the station. Day had heard similar alarms before, during reactor drills on Earth. But this felt different. This felt real. The announcement system crackled to life with Chief Engineer Plexhigh's voice, distorted by static and what sounded like genuine fear. "All students and faculty report to designated emergency stations. Primary life support has failed in sectors 7, 12, and 15. Backup systems are experiencing cascading failures due to software incompatibilities. Current estimates show 47 hours of emergency reserves remaining. Rescue vessels have been dispatched but will not arrive for a minimum of 60 hours. The math was simple and terrifying. They had 13 hours less air than they needed to survive. Park Ji-hoon burst into Day's room without knocking, his usually calm demeanor cracked with panic. "Did you hear that? We're all going to die up here." His English was getting sloppy, the way it did when he was stressed, mixing in Korean phrases that his translator couldn't handle. Students flooded into the main assembly hall like water seeking the lowest point. The massive space filled with the sounds of fear, clicking, humming, chittering, and harmonizing as dozens of species tried to process what they'd just heard. The Trilaxians formed their traditional comfort circles, gill slits fluttering rapidly as they hyperventilated. The Vexari were clicking their mandibles in rapid staccato patterns that meant extreme distress. Even the normally unflappable Gorath were rumbling in frequencies so low they made the floor vibrate. Veltar had somehow procured a holographic projector and was displaying station schematics on the main wall. "We need to organize committees immediately," he announced, his tentacles weaving through the air in what Day had learned were command gestures among his people. Life support failures of this magnitude require systematic analysis and coordinated response. Committee chairs were quickly selected from each species. The Kaleth beings harmonized to choose their representative. The Trilaxians voted using their complex fingerspeak language. The Vexari simply deferred to whoever had the most impressive mandible decorations, which seemed to be their version of academic credentials. "First, we need to analyze all possible causes of the cascade failure," announced Yuna, who had somehow been elected as the Trilaxian representative. "Then we model 17 different repair scenarios, accounting for species-specific environmental requirements and safety protocols." "Agreed," chimed one of the crystalline beings. "We must also consider the psychological impact on station morale and develop appropriate counseling protocols for each species' stress responses." The debate continued, voices rising as fear made everyone talk faster and louder. Day listened for about 5 minutes before he realized that none of them were actually talking about fixing anything. They were talking about fixing things. They were forming committees to form committees. He slipped out of the assembly hall without anyone noticing. In a crisis, humans didn't form committees. They acted. The station's maintenance levels were a maze of corridors barely wide enough for human shoulders, filled with pipes, conduits, and access panels that were clearly designed for automated repair drones rather than living beings. The Emergency lighting down here was sparse, leaving long stretches of shadow between pools of red illumination. Day pulled out his tablet and accessed the station's maintenance database. The life support failures weren't random, they followed a pattern. The solar storm had caused electromagnetic pulses that fried sensitive control circuits, but only in systems that had received recent software updates. The new software was supposed to be more efficient, but it couldn't handle the unexpected power fluctuations. The backup systems had tried to compensate, but they were running the same updated software. When the primaries failed, the backups tried to take over, encountered the same problems, and shut down to prevent what they calculated as potentially dangerous operating conditions. It was a classic cascade failure, the kind of thing that happened when you had too many safety systems all trying to protect you from the same threat. The real damage was 3 levels down, in sections of the station that had been sealed off due to atmospheric contamination from the storm. Warning signs in 17 languages made it clear that entering these areas without proper protective equipment was extremely dangerous. Radiation levels were spiking, toxic gases were leaking from damaged environmental systems, and the temperature was climbing toward levels that would cook most galactic species in minutes. Day checked his radiation detector and winced. The levels were already high enough to make most alien medical officers demand immediate evacuation, but they weren't high enough to kill a human, at least not quickly. Earth's background radiation was higher than most inhabited worlds, and humans had evolved cellular repair mechanisms that could handle a lot more punishment than their galactic neighbors. He squeezed through an access hatch that was barely wide enough for his shoulders and found himself in a maintenance tunnel that stretched away into darkness. His comm unit crackled with static as the radiation interfered with the signal, but he could still make out voices from the assembly hall debating committee structures and procedural frameworks. The damaged control circuits were exactly where the schematic said they'd be, buried deep in a junction box that would have required shutting down half the station's power grid to access safely. But there was nothing safe about their current situation. They needed life support working in the next few hours, not the next few days. Day opened his toolkit and got to work. His comm unit squawked with Professor Helix's voice, distorted by static and what sounded like genuine panic. Day, respond. Immediately. Station sensors show you've entered a contaminated zone. Radiation levels in your sector exceed safe limits by 400%. Return to the assembly hall at once. He looked at the fried control circuits, then at the jury-rigged bypass he was halfway through installing. The work would take at least another hour, maybe 2. If he stopped now to debate safety protocols, they'd all be breathing recycled air from the emergency reserves while the rescue ships found their frozen corpses. Day reached over and switched off his comm unit. The sudden silence was almost peaceful. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of voices still debating in the assembly hall. They were probably forming a committee to analyze why he wasn't responding to their calls. He went back to work. Someone had to. While the main assembly hall buzzed with increasingly frantic committee meetings, a smaller group of students had quietly broken away to do something that should have been obvious from the beginning. They started researching humans. Yuna sat in the corner of the library, her gill slits fluttering rapidly as she scrolled through Earth's cultural database. What she was reading didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. Her translator kept glitching, insisting that certain concepts had no equivalent in Trilaxian language. "Listen to this," she whispered to Park Ji-hoon, who had abandoned the main committee after the 3rd hour of procedural debates. Human children play recreational activities where they chase each other at velocities that would trigger emergency evacuation protocols on Trilax Prime. They call this tag and consider it fun. Ji-hoon nodded grimly. "I've seen Day run. What you call emergency speed, he calls warming up." Veltar slithered over, his tentacles twitching with agitation. He'd been deep in Earth's meteorological records, and what he'd found was giving him nightmares. Their homeworld experiences atmospheric storms that generate electromagnetic pulses capable of destroying unshielded electronics, he said, his voice tight with disbelief. These storms are so common that humans have a word for the season when they occur most frequently. They call it hurricane season and they throw parties. One of the Kaleth beings resonated over to join them, her crystalline body chiming with distressed harmonics. "I've been reading about human recreational activities," she said. "They voluntarily jump from aircraft at extreme altitudes using only fabric sheets to prevent fatal impact. They call this skydiving and consider it relaxing." The research continued, each discovery more disturbing than the last. Humans regularly engaged in activities that would be classified as industrial accidents on most civilized worlds. They ate foods that were literally toxic to other species and called them spicy. They exercised by lifting heavy objects repeatedly until their muscles tore, then considered this beneficial. They played sports where the objective was to physically tackle other humans at high speed. "No wonder Day seems reckless," Yuna murmured, scrolling through images of human extreme sports. "He evolved on a world where our definition of catastrophic system failure is apparently just Tuesday afternoon." The data painted a picture of a species that had spent millions of years adapting to conditions that would kill most galactic citizens within hours. Earth's atmospheric pressure was higher than most habitable worlds. The gravity was crushing by galactic standards. The weather was chaotically unpredictable, swinging between temperature extremes that would require emergency shelters on civilized planets. The geology was unstable, with frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Even the biology was hostile. Most of Earth's native life forms were either poisonous, venomous, or actively trying to eat each other. "Look at this," Ji-hoon said, pulling up human physiological data. "Their baseline stress hormone levels are higher than most species' emergency crisis readings. What we consider panic mode, they consider normal Tuesday morning. Meanwhile, 3 levels below them, Day was proving every word of their research correct. He'd been working for 36 consecutive hours now, sustained by stimulants that would have put most galactic species in intensive care. His tablet showed caffeine levels in his bloodstream that should have caused cardiac arrest in any reasonable biology. Instead, he was still thinking clearly, still problem-solving, still adapting to conditions that changed every few minutes as new systems failed and others came online. The radiation levels in his section had climbed even higher, but Day barely noticed. Growing up on Earth meant growing up with background radiation levels that most species considered dangerous. His cells had repair mechanisms that had been honed by millions of years of cosmic ray exposure and naturally occurring radioactive elements. The temperature had risen to levels that would have cooked most alien physiology, but humans were adapted to function in desert heat that regularly exceeded these temperatures. The toxic atmospheric mix would have been lethal to species that evolved on worlds with carefully balanced atmospheric chemistry, but Earth's early atmosphere had been a poisonous soup of methane and hydrogen sulfide. Human metabolism could handle a lot worse than a few industrial chemical leaks. His vital signs, when the station's sensors could get readings through the interference, showed stress levels that should have rendered any rational being unconscious. His heart rate was elevated but steady. His brain activity was intensely focused rather than scattered. His muscle tension indicated someone working hard, but not yet approaching his limits. The monitoring station in the assembly hall was painting a picture that terrified his alien classmates. According to their medical databases, Day should have collapsed hours ago. According to their safety protocols, he should have died from radiation exposure before he even reached the damaged sections. According to their understanding of reasonable behavior, he should have never entered those areas in the first place. But their databases, protocols, and understanding were all based on species that had evolved in safe, stable environments. They were trying to apply logic from worlds where the biggest environmental threat was seasonal weather variation to someone whose ancestors had survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, and extinction events that had wiped out most life on their planet. "He's not ignoring safety protocols," Veltar realized, watching Day's vital signs hold steady despite conditions that would have killed him within minutes. "He's operating under safety protocols designed for creatures who evolved in an environment that was actively trying to kill them." The revelation was spreading through the student body like wildfire. Humans weren't reckless. They were adapted to levels of risk that other species couldn't even imagine. What looked like dangerous improvisation was actually highly refined survival instincts, honed by millions of years of living on a world that had no mercy for the weak, the slow, or the cautious. Day kept working, unaware that his classmates were finally beginning to understand why humans had earned their reputation as Deathworlders. He had components salvaged from 7 different systems jury-rigged into a hybrid solution that violated dozens of engineering principles, but somehow kept functioning. His repairs looked chaotic to eyes trained on careful, methodical approaches, but every modification was calculated to trade minor risks for major gains. He was doing exactly what humans had always done, taking the universe as he found it, adapting to conditions that couldn't be changed, and finding ways to survive that more cautious species would never even consider. And slowly, impossibly, he was winning. The moment life support hummed back to full power, Kepler Station felt different. The air tasted cleaner, flowed more smoothly through the ventilation systems. Even the artificial gravity seemed more stable, though that might have been everyone's imagination after 43 hours of thinking they were going to die in space. Day emerged from the maintenance levels looking like he'd been through a war. His clothes were torn from crawling through spaces barely wide enough for human shoulders. His hands were burned from working with live electrical systems. His hair was singed from getting too close to overheated components. But he was grinning with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who had just pulled off the impossible. The alien students gathered around him in the main corridor, keeping what they probably thought was a respectful distance, but what looked more like the kind of space you'd give a dangerous wild animal. They stared at him with expressions that mixed awe, fear, and complete confusion. "How?" Feltar asked, his tentacles writhing in patterns that indicated deep bewilderment. "The radiation levels alone should have killed you. The temperature readings showed environmental conditions that exceed survival parameters for any known species." Day shrugged and wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. "Got hot down there," he admitted, "but not Death Valley hot. And the radiation wasn't too bad. About what you'd get from a chest x-ray every hour or so." The comparison meant nothing to his alien classmates, but it told him everything he needed to know about the gap between their worlds and his. When the rescue vessels arrived 11 hours ahead of schedule, since they were no longer racing against time to recover corpses, their engineering teams immediately descended on Days. Jury-rigged repairs with the fascination of archaeologists discovering an unknown civilization. Chief Engineer Plexhigh spent 3 hours crawling through the same maintenance shafts Day had navigated, her tentacles probing connections and modifications that shouldn't have worked according to everything she'd been taught about proper engineering. Her skin cycled through colors that had no names in human language, expressing concepts like technically impossible but functionally perfect, and violates all known principles while somehow exceeding design specifications. "This coupling should have failed immediately," she muttered, examining a power relay that Day had basically rebuilt from scratch using components from 4 different systems. "The stress loads are completely outside acceptable parameters. The harmonic resonance should have created cascade failures throughout the entire network." Day looked at the modification with the critical eye of someone reviewing his own work. "For your species, maybe," he said, exhaustion making him more blunt than usual. "Humans build things assuming they'll break. These modifications account for failure modes you never considered because your worlds never taught you they were possible." The chief engineer's skin shifted to a color that indicated she was thinking so hard it almost hurt. "You designed redundancy for failures that our safety protocols don't even recognize as possibilities. Earth taught us that safety protocols are just suggestions," Day replied. "The universe doesn't care about your carefully calculated risk assessments. Sometimes you have to build something that works even when everything goes wrong at the same time." The rescue engineers spent another day documenting Day's modifications before they realized something that shocked them even more than his unorthodox methods. His jury-rigged repairs hadn't just restored life support. They'd improved the station's overall efficiency by 23%. Systems were running smoother, power distribution was more stable, and backup redundancies were actually more robust than they'd been with the original equipment. Professor Helix called a special assembly for all students and faculty. The main hall filled with beings who had spent the crisis either debating committee structures or researching human evolutionary history, depending on their personality types. Now they were all here to learn what had actually happened while they were talking. "What we witnessed during this crisis," Professor Helix began, her skin cycling through academic colors, represents a fundamental misunderstanding of risk assessment methodologies. What we perceived as recklessness was actually highly sophisticated decision-making, adapted to environmental conditions we cannot imagine. She brought up holographic displays showing Day's vital signs during the repair work, alongside comparative data from other species under similar stress conditions. The differences were dramatic. Where other species showed exponential increases in stress hormones leading to system shutdown, human physiology showed controlled elevation, followed by sustained performance under conditions that should have been lethal. Deathworld species don't skip safety protocols, she continued. They operate under entirely different assumptions about what constitutes acceptable risk. Their safety margins account for variables that our worlds never taught us to consider. Park Ji-hoon raised his hand, his expression thoughtful. So when humans say something is safe enough, they mean something completely different than we do? Exactly, Professor Helix replied. Human safe enough includes survival parameters for solar radiation, atmospheric toxicity, seismic instability, weather systems that can destroy infrastructure, and biological threats that would require military intervention on most civilized worlds. Their risk assessment is calibrated to conditions where what we consider catastrophic failure is simply another Tuesday. The implications rippled through the audience like shockwaves. The careful, methodical approaches that had served galactic civilization for thousands of years were perfectly adequate for maintaining stable systems in predictable environments. But they were completely inadequate for genuine innovation or crisis response. Yuna stood up, her gill slits fluttering with what Day had learned to recognize as intellectual excitement. This explains why human technological development progressed so rapidly. They were willing to attempt projects with failure rates that would be considered criminally irresponsible by our standards. Not willing, Day corrected gently. Required, too. On Earth, if you wait for perfect conditions and guaranteed success, you die. Our ancestors learned to make decisions with incomplete information, to build solutions that could adapt to changing circumstances, and to accept calculated risks, because the alternative was extinction. The assembly continued for hours, but the fundamental lesson was simple. There was a difference between recklessness and adaptability, between ignorance and calculated risk-taking, between primitive thinking and survival-focused problem-solving. By the time the formal rescue operations concluded and normal station operations resumed, something fundamental had changed in how the galactic community viewed humans. They were still newcomers, still rough around the edges by civilized standards, but they were no longer dismissed as primitive Deathworlders who had stumbled into space through blind luck. They were survivors. And in a universe that was vast, dangerous, and fundamentally unpredictable, survival skills were suddenly looking very valuable indeed. The Academy's curriculum was quietly revised to include something called crisis engineering principles, though everyone knew it should have been called how to think like a human. Day found himself reluctantly appointed as an instructor, teaching alien students how to make decisions when you don't have time for committees, how to build things that work even when everything goes wrong, and most importantly, how to accept that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe. His first lesson was simple. The universe doesn't care about your safety protocols, but if you understand why humans ignore them, you might survive long enough to develop better ones.